Today we'll be talking about the Cold War, but unlike my previous lecture, I'll be focusing on international matters instead of particularly talking about the domestic affairs.
It is generally accepted that the Cold War had its beginning with the declaration of the Truman Doctrine of 1947. But I think it started much earlier, during the Iran incident of 1942. Let's briefly talk about that. In 1942, the Soviet army had occupied North Iran, and Britain had occupied the southern part of Iran. The occupation was to prevent the crucial Iranian oil resources falling to the Nazis. On 15 March 1946, the British duly withdrew, but the Soviet army did not. More importantly, the Soviet troop movement along the borders of Iran led the US to suspect that the Russians were seeking to dominate Iran. In a situation like this, the then US Secretary of State took a hard line. He sent strong protest notes to Moscow and the United Nations. Finally, the Soviet Union withdrew her troops from Iran in May after obtaining some oil concessions from the Iranian government. US President learned two lessons from the Iranian incident. Firstly, the oil concessions obtained from Iran convinced America that the Soviet Union was bent on extending its sphere of influence. And secondly, a policy of firmness towards the Soviet Union paid dividends. US President Harry Truman, having lost all faith in the Soviet Union, adopted a strong policy towards her. The Truman Doctrine was a reflection of this particular policy. President Truman finally inaugurated the containment of Soviet expansionism. The announcement of the Truman Doctrine came after the British government decided to reduce its foreign commitments. After the liberation of Greece from the Nazis, the British troops were stationed there as a security measure. The purpose was to render all possible help to the non-communist government established there. The communist insurgents, supported by the communist governments established in Albania, Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, had been trying in all possible ways to take over the government. Despite the British help, the anti-communist government was unable to prevent the insurgents from securing control over the larger part of Greece. The British government, faced with financial problems in the early 1947, announced that from February 1st it would withdraw all support to the non-communist governments of Greece and Turkey. President Truman's response was immediate. By the declaration of the Truman Doctrine, America stepped into the British shoes left in Greece and Turkey. Before introducing a bill in the American Congress for financial aid to Greece and Turkey, President Truman promised that the US would support free peoples who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. In implementing the Truman Doctrine, he made a grant of $4 million to Greece and Turkey. The objectives of the Truman Doctrine were firstly, prevention of the Soviet influence in the Balkans and the Middle East. Secondly, to give adequate reply to the formation of a ring of satellite states around the Soviet Union. Thirdly, to bring neutral and weak powers closer to the US. Now let's move on to the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was a proposal drawn up by the US Secretary of State, George Marshall, offering US economic and financial aid to fight hunger, poverty and chaos that followed the Second World War. The economic ruin that had overtaken the European countries like France, Belgium, Italy, West Germany, Britain, etc. was likely to give rise to serious political consequences. The situation was favorable for any kind of socialist propaganda. In the circumstances, the United States of America made a wider interpretation of Truman Doctrine and came forward with a helping hand to the European powers. On June 5, 1947, Marshall explained the American plan for European recovery in a speech at Harvard University. It was stated in the speech that the United States of America was prepared to render assistance to the European states in order to fight poverty, economic dissatisfaction, shortage of food in them, and thereby to bring stability in the political, social and economic life of those countries. The precondition of the assistance was that every country should have to try of its own accord for recovery. The initiative must come from the countries which would like to receive the assistance. The Marshall Plan was the wider application or the operative clause of such assistance to the economically ruined countries in order to make them immune from the communist propaganda and to bring them in alliance against the Soviet bloc. One thing was certain, that the attempt made by the United States unilaterally for the European recovery took away much of the importance of the United Nations. The objectives of the Marshall Plan were both political and economic. Politically, the Marshall Plan aimed at freeing the European countries from the Soviet influence. Economically, it was an effort to promote the economic revival of Europe and to ensure the continued prosperity of American economy. Now let's talk about the Soviet Union's response to the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. It may be said without any shade of doubt that the very success of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan caused a crisis in the US-Soviet relations. The Soviet Union asked its satellite states not to accept help from any of the American plans. Later on, Soviet Union started criticizing the Marshall Plan in the strongest possible terms. By 1948, it was found that Europe had become divided into two political economic blocs, one centered around the US and the other with the Soviet Union. However, it is to be remembered that the Marshall Plan was the extension of the Truman Doctrine. The Cold War gained momentum as the Soviet Union took certain reciprocal measures in reply to the Marshall Plan. Firstly, the Soviet Union forced Poland and Czechoslovakia to reject American aid and form their own trading bloc. Secondly, the Communist Party of Soviet Union launched a steady propaganda campaign against the bourgeois literature and culture. Thirdly, by the end of 1948, non-communist leaders of Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia and Albania were all eliminated by terrorism. Fourthly, Soviet Union speeded up the consolidation of Soviet control in Eastern Europe. For example, there was communist takeover of the government in Czechoslovakia in February 1948. Apart from Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, the real disagreement between the Soviet Union and the Western European powers and the US started over Germany. After the Second World War, at Potsdam Conference, it was decided that Germany would undergo 5 Ds. Those are demilitarization, deindustrialization, decentralization, democratization, and denazification. Germany was to be divided into 4 zones, namely American, Soviet, French, and British. Though divided into 4 zones, Germany was to be treated as a single economic unit. Allied Control Council would be formed with its headquarters in Berlin to supervise the working of Germany as a single economic unit. Like Germany, its capital Berlin was also to be divided into 4 zones. Berlin would be placed under a council. Now, Germany was the most important of all European countries. Its geographical location, natural resources, industrial progress, and the technological skill of the people made Germany the crucial country. Lenin was aware of this. That is exactly the reason why he said, whoever has Germany has Europe. As Germany came to be divided into 4 zones, each occupying country desired to mold its zone according to its own way. The result was that Germany came to be divided politically and economically as well as militarily. But America was in favor of reviving the economic potential of Germany. Besides, US also was interested in the idea of integrating the 3 zones, those of Britain, France and America, into a single unit. Currency reform in West Germany was also in the agenda of the Western powers. The Soviet Union, however, was opposed to all this. In fact, the Soviet Union withdrew itself from the Allied Control Council when the Western powers went ahead with their program. Now let's talk about what was the reason for the Soviet objection. The Soviet apprehension was that in the event of integration of the 3 zones of Germany into a single unit, the 3/4 of the German population would be united under the Western powers. With the financial aid flowing from America and other Western powers, the economic condition of the majority of German people would be improved. West Germany would be an ally of the US and thereby posed to be a danger to the Soviet Union. Now let's move on to the Berlin crisis. On June 23, 1948, currency reforms were introduced in the Western-held 3 zones. The new currency, Deutsche Mark, was put into circulation. The very next day, Soviet Union retaliated by cutting off all links to West Berlin. Thus the Berlin blockade of 1948 began. Like Germany, its capital Berlin had also been divided into 4 zones. Its western part was divided among the 3 Western powers and the eastern part was under the Soviet control. As a consequence of the Berlin blockade, 2.4 million inhabitants of West Berlin had been deprived of food and supply. The British and the Americans jointly responded to the Soviet challenge. For 11 months, an enormous fleet of aircraft kept open the lines of communication between the Western powers and the West Berliners. The round-the-clock airlift to Berlin caught the world's imagination and cast the Soviet Union in a bad light. Finally, in May 1949, Stalin eventually acknowledged the failure of the blockade and ended it. The importance of the Berlin blockade cannot be underrated. Why? Firstly, since 1948, power politics became more dangerous than ever before as the rival powers made use of every opportunity to discredit their opponent. Secondly, the attempt made by the Soviet Union through the Berlin blockade to create a divide between America, Britain and France was not successful. Thirdly, Berlin was the first conflict in the nuclear age to show the strong tendency on both sides to remain cautious. Now let's move on to the result of the Berlin crisis. The Berlin crisis produced a hardening of the hostility between East and the West. Within a very short time, the two German states came into being. Each of the states was sponsored by its occupying power. In the West, the Federal Republic of Germany was established by the occupying Western powers. Those were the US, Britain and France. In the East, there was the Democratic Republic of Germany established by its occupying power, the Soviet Union. The Berlin crisis thus paved the way for formation of military alliances. The Berlin crisis convinced the leaders of the West European countries that it was only the United States that could ensure the balance of power in Europe. This realization led the British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin to think about a system in which the US could be made a partner in Europe. In March 1948, Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands and Luxembourg signed the Brussels Pact. The motive was to ensure mutual security in case of an attack by any other power. Such an alliance system was welcomed by the then US President Truman. He described the Brussels Pact as a notable step in the direction of unity in Europe for protection and preservation of its civilization. It was in this context that the American Senate passed the Vandenberg Resolution on 11 June 1948. By this resolution, the US military aid was promised to defense pacts made between other members of the United Nations if these were in the interest of the US. Accordingly, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed in Washington in April 1949, which later on became an organization known as NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Britain, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, all signatories to the Brussels Pact, and America, Canada, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, Portugal, and Norway signed the treaty. Later on, in 1952, Greece and Turkey put their signature to it. Clearly, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was a military alliance with the United States as a leading partner. The objectives of NATO were firstly to maintain international peace and security, secondly, peaceful solution of international disputes, thirdly, it bound the parties to maintain and develop their individual and collective capacity to resist an armed attack, fourthly, an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. It may be pointed out that in the post-World War II period, the Western European countries had simply no power to match the military power of the Soviet Union. Because of that, the Western European countries tried to ensure their security by an alliance with a nuclear power like that of the United States. With the signing of the NATO, the Cold War entered into a new phase. Now, the Soviet reply to the signing of the NATO was the Warsaw Pact. In 1949, the Soviet Union for the first time successfully tested the atomic bomb and thus became the second nuclear power in the world. The military alliance known as the Warsaw Pact, the real name was the Eastern European Mutual Assistance Treaty, was a direct reply to the formation of NATO. More specifically, it was a Soviet reaction to the inclusion of West Germany as a member of the NATO. However, like NATO, the Warsaw Pact also came into existence from the security needs of the Soviet Union and her associates. The pact was signed by Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union. It pledged its members to work for a general reduction in armaments and to respect each other's independence and sovereignty. Two events in 1949 appeared to the Western powers, particularly the United States, as communist threat. One was the successful explosion for the first time of the atomic bomb, and thereby Soviet Union claimed equal status as a nuclear power with the US. Second was the overthrow of the nationalists in China, who were America's wartime allies. Indeed, ignorance about communist China in the early days led to fear of Chinese intentions in the external relations. Mao Zedong operated the international relations of the People's Republic of China on the basis of a theory known as the theory of intermediary zone. The theory was projected in the context of the ongoing Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. According to the theory, Mao was convinced that the real Cold War between the two superpowers was taking place in the intermediary zone of Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and not in Europe. In this zone, the real struggle was between the revolutionary nationalism and imperialism. Mao accordingly played a leading role in supporting the countries of the intermediary zone to achieve independence. Mao got China involved in the costly Korean War in support of North Korea against American and the UN forces. It was largely because Mao's support that North Korea could maintain her independence. In 1960, China at first supported Ho Chi Minh of North Vietnam. Later on, of course, China drew back as Mao Zedong was not prepared to be involved in a war with the US over Vietnam issue. China after 1949 got involved in wars along its frontier on several occasions. Often the purpose was of recovering lands lost earlier, which the Chinese regarded as being their own. The real cause of bitter relations between the People's Republic of China and America was the support and recognition given by the latter to the regime of Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan. No doubt that China wanted the reconquest of Taiwan, but Mao was not at all ready to enter into a war against the US. Despite differences of opinion on many issues, there was no occasion for a China-US war. After 1960, when China-Soviet relations became bitter, China improved her relations with the US. I already mentioned that Korean War was crucial to China's foreign policy in Asia. So we'll start with Korean War here, and we'll talk about how the Korean War actually started and how it ended. Korea had been under the Japanese occupation since 1910. It was the American and Soviet army that freed Korea from Japan. After the defeat of Japan in the World War II, Korea was divided along 38 parallel, north of the line being under the Soviet occupation force and the Americans in the south. By 1948, a communist government had been established in North Korea headed by Kim Il-sung, and the Soviet troops left North Korea. In South Korea, Syngman Rhee established his dictatorial rule. Rhee, however, felt anxious in the face of North Korea's superior armed strength. American forces withdrew from the South Korea, and the then Secretary of State declared that South Korea was not within the defensive area of the US. The world was taken by surprise in June 1950 when North Korean forces crossed the 38 parallel and attacked South Korea. There is a difference of opinion among historians as regards to who provoked North Korea to attack. Firstly, some historians believe that it was People's Republic of China who provoked North Korea. Secondly, according to some historians, that it was Stalin who masterminded North Korean attack on South Korea. And thirdly, a few historians believed that it was not on Stalin's order, but out of a deep nationalist conviction to unify the country and revolutionize the South that Kim Il-sung attacked South Korea. Whoever might have been responsible for the war, the Korean War eventually came under the fold of the Cold War. And the Korean War was an example how the Cold War had spread outside the European continent to Asia. Of the two superpowers, however, the American involvement in the Korean War was much greater. Stalin was careful not to become too involved in the conflict. On a complaint lodged by the US to the UN Security Council, North Korea was declared an aggressor. As Soviet Union at the time had boycotted the Security Council, it could not veto the decision. The UN appointed MacArthur as the commander of the UN force in North Korea. Within a short time, MacArthur pushed North Korean soldiers back. In October 1950, MacArthur, under the direction of the US, disregarded the UN resolution and crossed the 38th parallel towards North Korea. At this juncture, China intervened and the UN and South Korean forces were driven back, and the campaign ended in an armistice in 1953, close to the 38th parallel, the point at which the war had first begun. Now let's talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the Cuban dictator Batista and established a Soviet-supported totalitarian regime. As tensions increased between the new government in Havana and the United States, the Eisenhower administration broke relations with Cuba and drafted plans to overthrow Castro, who reacted by drawing closer to Moscow. Soon after taking office in early 1961, Kennedy approved a plan to support an invasion of Cuba by anti-Castro exiles. But the attempted landing at the Bay of Pigs in southern Cuba was an utter failure. At Castro's invitation, the Soviet Union then began to station nuclear missiles in Cuba within striking distance of the American mainland. Khrushchev was quick to point out that the United States had placed nuclear weapons in Turkey within easy range of the Soviet Union. When the US intelligence discovered that a Soviet fleet carrying more missiles was heading to Cuba, Kennedy decided to dispatch US warships into the Atlantic to prevent the fleet from reaching its destination. This approach to the problem was risky, but had the benefit of providing the two sides with time to find a peaceful solution. After a tense standoff during which the two countries came frighteningly close to a direct nuclear confrontation, Khrushchev finally sent a conciliatory letter to Kennedy agreeing to turn back the fleet if Kennedy pledged not to invade Cuba. In a secret concession not revealed until many years later, the president also promised to dismantle US missiles in Turkey. The realization that the world might have faced annihilation in a matter of days had a profound effect on both sides. A communication hotline between Moscow and Washington was installed in 1963 to expedite rapid communication between the two powers in time of crisis. In the same year, the two powers agreed to ban nuclear tests in the atmosphere, a step that served to lessen the tensions between the two nations.